The kitchen fell silent, the hum of activity replaced by an oppressive stillness. Margot's staff exchanged uneasy glances, and I could feel the weight of their eyes on me. Margot, for her part, straightened her shoulders, her voice icy. "I suggest you look elsewhere, detective. My team and I worked tirelessly to make tonight perfect. I'd have no reason to ruin it, let alone poison someone. And yet," I said, "Victor Garneau is dead, and your dish was the delivery system. If you're innocent, you'll want to help me figure out who did this." Margot hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. "Fine. Ask your questions. But if you're looking for a scapegoat, you won't find one here." I took another glance around the kitchen, noting the spotless counters, the neatly arranged ingredients, and the tense faces of her team. They all looked professional, but something about the sous chef, a wiry man with a sharp jawline and darting eyes, caught my attention. He was sweating, even though the kitchen wasn't unusually hot. "What's your name?" I asked, pointing at him. He flinched but stepped forward. "Julien. Julien Moreau. I'm the sous chef." "How long have you worked with Chef Leroux?" "Since she opened her first restaurant," he said quickly. "I followed her here after everything happened with Garneau." "Seems like you're loyal," I said. "How'd you feel about Garneau ruining her first restaurant?" Julien's jaw tightened. It wasn't fair. Chef Leroux didn't deserve what he wrote. He was a bully, plain and simple. And tonight? Did you see or hear anything unusual before Garneau collapsed? He hesitated, his eyes flicking to Margot. "No," he said finally. "Everything was normal." "Normal. Sure." I made a note to dig deeper into Julien's past. He clearly had a grudge against Garneau, and his loyalty to Margot might have motivated him to act on it. Before I could press him further, Martinez appeared at the kitchen door. "Thorne, you need to see this." I followed her to the restaurant storage room, where a small vial sat on a metal shelf, half hidden behind jars of spices. Martinez held up an evidence bag containing the vial. "Lab already tested it," she said. "Aconitine. Someone stashed it here." I frowned, examining the vial. It was unmarked, the kind of container you could buy at any apothecary or online store. "Any prints?" "Not yet," Martinez said. "But the location's suspicious. This shelf is only accessible to the kitchen staff." The noose was tightening around Margot and her team, but something still didn't sit right with me. If someone was framing her, planting the vial here was a smart move. Too smart, maybe. I decided to speak with the sommelier again. Her earlier comment about Garneau mocking her wine pairing stuck with me. She was in a position to approach his table multiple times during the evening. When I found her, she was leaning against the bar, a glass of water in her trembling hand. "You seem nervous," I said. She jumped, nearly spilling the water. "Of course I'm nervous," she snapped. "A man died tonight?" "True. But you also had reason to dislike him. He criticized your wine pairings, didn't he?" Her face flushed. "He did. But do you have any idea how many people he's insulted over the years?" "I'm not the only one." "Maybe not," I said. "But you had the opportunity to tamper with his wine." She glared at me. "And you think I'd risk my career over a bad review?" "I'm not stupid, detective." "No, but someone here is desperate enough to risk everything," I said. "If it's not you, then maybe you saw something? Anything unusual near Garneau's table?" Her expression softened slightly, and she glanced over her shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear. "I did see someone near his table right before the food was served," she admitted. "Julien. He said he was delivering something from the kitchen, but I thought it was strange. That's not usually his job." Julien again. I thanked her and returned to the kitchen, where he was wiping down counters, his movements quick and precise. When he saw me, he froze. "Detective," he said, forcing a smile. "Something else you need?" "Yeah," I said. "An explanation. Why were you near Garneau's table tonight?" His face went pale. I was just checking to make sure everything was perfect. Chef Leroux wanted everything to go smoothly. And yet you didn't mention this before," I said, stepping closer. "What were you really doing, Julien?" His hands shook, and his eyes darted to Margot, who was watching from across the room, her expression unreadable. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," he stammered. My stomach tightened. "So you admit it? You poisoned Garneau?" "No," he shouted. "I didn't poison him. I wanted to scare him, that's all. I thought if he had a bad reaction to the dish, maybe he'd leave Chef Leroux alone. But I swear, I didn't use poison." "Then what did you use?" I demanded. A hot pepper extract," he said. "Something to make his mouth burn." I didn't know. His voice broke, and he sank onto a stool, burying his face in his hands. It wasn't the confession I'd expected, but it didn't explain the aconitine. Someone else had used Julien's prank as cover for a far deadlier plan. And whoever it was, they were still out there. It started with a phone call in the middle of the night. They always do. Thorne? We got a situation. High-profile case, downtown at Le Chantier. You'd better get here quick. By the time I pulled up to the high-end French restaurant, the flashing blue and red lights of squad cars were already painting the sleek glass facade. The place was packed with a who's who of the culinary world. Famous chefs, food bloggers, and critics, all of them milling about in confusion or huddled in tense whispers. Inside, the air smelled faintly of truffle oil and something acrid, the unmistakable tang of fear. Detective Thorne, Officer Martinez greeted me at the door, her expression grim. The victim's name is Victor Garneau. I stiffened. Everyone knew Victor Garneau. He wasn't just a food critic, he was the food critic. His reviews could make or break a chef's career, and he seemed to relish the power. Some called him a genius, others called him a sadist with a pen. Either way, his words carried weight, and tonight they'd gotten him killed. Martinez led me to a private dining room where Garneau's body was slumped in his chair. His eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of shock. A half-eaten plate of duck à l'orange sat before him, and his wine glass had toppled over, staining the pristine white tablecloth a deep burgundy. "What do we know?" I asked. "Preliminary reports suggest poisoning," Martinez said. "The medical examiner's on their way, but given the circumstances, it seems pretty cut and dry." I frowned. Things that seem cut and dry rarely are. I scanned the room, noting the ornate decor, a blend of modern elegance and old-world charm. Garneau had died surrounded by opulence, but death doesn't care about 5-star ratings. I crouched to examine the plate. "This his?" "Yeah," Martinez confirmed. "Apparently, it's the chef's signature dish." I straightened. "Who's the chef tonight?" "Margot Leroux," Martinez said, lowering her voice. "And get this, Garneau practically destroyed her career 2 years ago." That got my attention. Margot Leroux was a name I recognized. A culinary prodigy who'd risen to fame with daring, innovative dishes, only to be brought low by one of Garneau's infamous takedowns. His review of her first restaurant had been scathing, calling her food pretentious drivel and her execution amateur at best. The restaurant had closed within months, and Leroux had all but disappeared from the scene, until now. I found Margot in the kitchen, her pale face framed by a cascade of auburn curls that looked like they'd been hastily tucked under a chef's toque. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady as she directed her staff to clean up. When she noticed me, her emerald green eyes narrowed. "Detective," she said, her tone clipped. "I assume you're here about Mr. Garneau." "That's right," I said. "I understand he was eating your signature dish when he collapsed." Her jaw tightened. "That's correct. But if you're suggesting I had anything to do with his death, you're mistaken. I may have had my differences with the man, but I'm not a killer." "Differences," I repeated, arching an eyebrow. "That's one way to put it. He ruined your career, didn't he?" "He did," she admitted. "But I rebuilt it. Tonight was supposed to be my redemption, not a murder scene." I studied her for a moment. She seemed sincere, but I'd met plenty of good liars in my line of work. "Where were you when Garneau collapsed?" "Here, in the kitchen," she said. "Ask anyone on my staff. I didn't leave this room all night." "Anyone else have access to his plate?" I asked. "No one outside my kitchen," she said firmly. "And I can vouch for my team. They're professionals." "Professionals with no grudges against Garneau?" I pressed. Her hesitation was slight but noticeable. "None that I'm aware of." I nodded and left her to her work, though I made a mental note to dig into her staff's backgrounds. Back in the dining room, I began questioning the other guests. The tension was palpable. No one wanted to admit they'd had any reason to wish Garneau harm, but the truth was, plenty of people had motives. A rival critic muttered something about Garneau's unfair influence. A sous chef from another restaurant hinted at how Garneau's reviews had driven his boss to the brink of bankruptcy. Even the restaurant sommelier, a young woman with an air of quiet desperation, admitted that Garneau had mocked her wine pairings in a previous review. By the time the medical examiner arrived to confirm the cause of death, a lethal dose of aconitine, likely slipped into the sauce, I had a long list of potential suspects and no clear answers. I returned to the kitchen, where Margot was pacing like a caged tiger. "Detective," she said sharply, "are you any closer to finding out who did this?" "Closer, yes," I said. "But I've got questions. Starting with how aconitine ended up in your sauce." Her face went pale. "Aconitine? That's monk's hood." "Exactly. A rare poison, and not one you'd find in your average pantry. Any idea how it could have gotten into your kitchen?" "None," she said, shaking her head. "We source only the finest ingredients, and we're meticulous about quality control." "Meticulous or not, someone got to your dish," I said. "If it wasn't you, then someone's trying very hard to make it look like it was." Her eyes flashed with anger and fear. "You think I'm being framed?" "That's one possibility," I said. The other is that you're lying. Either way, I'm going to find out. I stepped back, letting Julian's words sink in. If he was telling the truth, and his trembling, panicked demeanor suggested he was, then the real killer had played him like a pawn. The prank with the pepper extract had been the perfect smokescreen, and someone had seized the opportunity to slip poison into Garneau's dish. "Martinez," I called out. She appeared at the doorway, her expression tight. "Take Julian in for questioning. We'll confirm his story about the extract. But keep him under wraps. If he's not our killer, I don't want whoever did this panicking and disappearing." Julian didn't resist as Martinez led him away, though he shot a desperate glance at Margot. She stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists, watching her sous-chef being escorted out. "You believe him, don't you?" she said quietly when we were alone. "That he didn't mean for this to happen?" "I think he's scared and stupid," I replied. "But scared and stupid doesn't mean innocent. His prank might have been the opening someone needed, or it might be part of a bigger lie. Either way, I'm not done here." Margot nodded, her shoulders slumping, the weight of the night settling on her. I couldn't tell if it was guilt or exhaustion, or both. I needed to retrace the steps of the poison. If Julian had handled the plate, the timing was crucial. I started with the kitchen staff, re-interviewing them one by one. Most had alibis that checked out, but there was something about the pastry chef, a young woman named Elise, that felt off. She was skittish, her answers overly rehearsed. "You seemed nervous earlier tonight," I said when I found her near the dessert station. "Why wouldn't I be?" she shot back, her voice defensive. "Someone died during service, and yet you were calm enough to deliver dessert to Garneau's table right before he collapsed?" Her eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't. Don't lie to me, Elise. I've already spoken to the waitstaff. You were seen near his table?" She bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. "I only brought him a macaron," she whispered. "It was a compliment from the kitchen, a peace offering from Chef Leroux. She thought it might soften him up before the review." I glanced at Margot, who was across the room, oblivious to our conversation. "Did Margot ask you to deliver it?" Elise nodded. "Yes, but I didn't poison it, I swear. I just plated it and brought it out. That's all." "And who prepared the macaron?" "I did," Elise stammered. "But the filling was prepped earlier, by—" Her voice faltered. "By who, Elise?" "Julian," she whispered, her face crumpling. "He made the filling." Julian had claimed innocence, but his fingerprints were all over this crime. I had Martinez pull his records while I returned to the station. By the time I got there, she had the file waiting for me. "Guess what I found?" she said, handing it over. "Julian Moreau was arrested 3 years ago in Marseille for possession of aconitine. He claimed it was for research, but the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. It was the break I needed, but something about it still didn't feel right. Julian didn't strike me as calculating enough to pull off something this precise. If he'd poisoned Garneau, why admit to the pepper extract prank? He could have played dumb, denied everything. And then it hit me. He wasn't the mastermind. He was being set up." Back at the restaurant, I pulled Margot aside. "I need to know everything about your relationship with Julian," I said. Her brows furrowed. "I already told you, he's loyal. He stuck with me when no one else did. Because he believed in your talent, or because he thought you owed him?" She flinched, and for a moment, her composure cracked. "What are you implying?" "Julian didn't poison Garneau. But someone used him, and my guess is they knew exactly how to manipulate him. So I'll ask again, how much do you really know about him?" Margot's silence was answer enough. She didn't know Julian as well as she thought, or maybe she didn't want to admit what she did know. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the lab results came back. The vial of aconitine had fingerprints, 2 sets. One was Julian's. The other belonged to the sommelier. I confronted her in the restaurant's wine cellar, where she was cataloging bottles with shaking hands. "You're good," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Using Julian to take the fall? Genius. You knew he'd do something stupid, like that pepper prank, and you used it as your opening?" "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't lie to me. You hated Garneau. He mocked your wine pairings, humiliated you in front of your peers. And you knew Margot was desperate to prove herself tonight. Framing her was just icing on the cake, wasn't it?" She backed away, her face pale. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can," I said. "Your prints are on the vial, and I've got a witness who saw you near the kitchen earlier tonight. You slipped the aconitine into the sauce before the dish left the kitchen. You thought no one would look at you twice." Her composure shattered, and she sank to the floor, sobbing. "He deserved it," she whispered. "The things he wrote, the way he destroyed people's lives, he deserved it." "Maybe he did," I said. "But now you're going to have to answer for it." As the sommelier was taken away in cuffs, Margot watched from the corner of the dining room, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Thank you, she said quietly as I passed her. Don't thank me yet, I said. Garneau's dead, and your restaurant will be in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. Redemption's a long road, chef. Make sure you're ready to walk it. With that, I left her to the chaos, stepping out into the crisp night air. Another case closed, but the taste it left in my mouth wasn't victory, it was bitterness.